In modern public debate, the terms left and right have become some of the most frequently used, yet least clarified labels in circulation. We use them constantly. We apply them to politicians, policies, commentators, even to friends and family. But more often than not, they function as shortcuts, quick ways to categorize people, rather than as serious frameworks for analyzing differences in political thought. Over time, something rather significant has happened. The term right-wing has drifted away from being a clearly defined position. Instead, it has become a kind of container, one that can be filled at will with whatever ideas are to be rejected, excluded, or morally condemned. When language turns into a tool of struggle, concepts begin to lose their boundaries. In this video, I want to suggest that within such a climate, the right has gradually become the largest straw man in contemporary discourse. A constructed opponent shaped less by careful understanding and more by the convenience of attack. This construction is not accidental. It is the result of long-term patterns in rhetoric, narrative framing, and the interaction between discourse and power. And it is a phenomenon that deserves to be examined far more carefully than it usually is. Hi everyone, I'm Eric, a cat who dreams of becoming a philosopher. This is the place where I share my thoughts and explore new ideas with you all. So, let's dive into today's topic. When we speak about the left and the right, the most common definition takes us back to the French Revolution. In the National Assembly, those who supported radical reform and the overthrow of the existing order sat on the left-hand side of the chamber. Those who favored preserving tradition and established institutions sat on the right. What began as a simple seating arrangement gradually evolved into a broader way of classifying political ideas and values. However, this historical origin does not, in itself, explain the deeper theoretical differences between the two. It is more a symbolic starting point than a fully developed framework. In general political usage, the left is often associated with equality, social justice, redistribution of resources, and public intervention. It tends to view social inequality as rooted in structural or institutional arrangements, and therefore believes these inequalities should be addressed through policy and collective action. The right, by contrast, is commonly described as emphasizing liberty, market mechanisms, personal responsibility, and traditional social order. It often argues that certain social differences are natural or functionally necessary, and that excessive intervention can disrupt the broader system. Yet in practice, this binary division quickly becomes blurred. Some positions favor free markets economically, while advocating strong regulatory norms in cultural matters. Others pursue progressive reform on social issues, yet call for fiscal restraint and caution in public spending. If we draw the dividing line simply as equality versus liberty, or reform versus tradition, we often fail to capture the complexity of real political life. In fact, many political parties and intellectual traditions are hybrids. On different issues, they may cross what we casually call the left-right divide. This suggests that the distinction is often more of a simplifying device than a precise analytic model. Moreover, the meaning of left and right shifts across time and place. In some countries, supporting a welfare state is considered a moderate centrist position, and others it may be labeled radical. The very same policy can be classified differently, depending on context. This tells us that so-called general definitions are relative concepts rather than fixed theoretical structures. With globalization and the rapid circulation of information, these meanings have become even more fluid. Different cultural traditions interpret the left-right spectrum in ways that overlap, diverge, and recombine. Perhaps most importantly, in public debate, left and right are rarely neutral descriptions. They carry weight and moral judgment. When people use these labels, they often imply an assumption of moral superiority or inferiority. As a result, definitions cease to function as neutral categories. Instead, they become tools for drawing boundaries between us and them. Over time, the right can shift from being a specific political stance into a symbol that absorbs a wide range of negative associations. Labels are powerful because they simplify and mobilize. But they also obscure detail, compressing complex questions into emotional confrontation. If we genuinely wish to understand the difference between left and right, we cannot stop at surface-level contrasts and values. We must examine the theoretical assumptions and conceptual logic beneath them. Otherwise, what we call general definitions risk becoming slogans, endlessly repeated, rarely examined, and all too easily used as instruments of persuasion. If we look at the historical development of these terms, something rather revealing appears. The left emerged as a self-conscious political identity before the right did. During the French Revolution and the intellectual movements that followed, the left presented itself as an active force for change. It defined itself through opposition to the old regime. It called for the reconstruction of social order, emphasized popular sovereignty, and sought institutional transformation. At that time, there was no fully formed body of thought calling itself the right. Instead, the right functioned largely as a reactive label, used to describe those who resisted or questioned radical reform. In other words, history did not begin with two symmetrical theories facing one another. Rather, one position first defined itself as progressive and reformist, and then grouped whatever opposed it into the other camp. Once the left defined itself as the force that would overturn hierarchy and tradition, those who defended continuity and order were naturally placed on the opposite side. In this sense, the concept of the right was born in relation to the left. This relational origin has had lasting consequences. Semantically, the right has often carried a secondary or responsive tone, rather than being seen as an independent source of theoretical innovation. Over the following centuries, this pattern shaped political language. Frequently, the right has not been defined by its own internal logic, but by what it opposes. If a position does not align with the reformist trajectory set by the left, it may simply be classified as right-wing. As a result, the concept has remained highly elastic, sometimes lacking a stable core. Different traditions such as conservatism, classical liberalism, and nationalism have at various points been grouped under the same label, despite significant differences between them. By the 19th century, as socialist thought became more systematic, the left increasingly identified itself with egalitarianism and collective ownership. Those who defended market exchange, private property, or limited government were gradually categorized as the right. Yet even this development followed the earlier logic. The dividing line was drawn according to one's stance towards a particular direction of reform, rather than through the construction of two fully symmetrical intellectual systems. Even within liberalism, thinkers have at times been labeled both left and right, which highlights how unstable the classification can be. By the 20th century, the idea of a political spectrum had become widespread. The left was seen as pursuing deeper social transformation. The right is defending existing structures or limiting the speed and scale of change. But notice something important. This framework still takes the left as its reference point. Whatever lies outside its project is placed at the other end. Consequently, the right often becomes a catch-all term, encompassing movements and philosophies that differ profoundly from one another. Historically, then, the right did not begin as a fully articulated and unified theory. It emerged after the left had already defined itself, serving as a collective label for what lay in the opposite direction. This sequence of formation created a subtle imbalance, one that later made it easier for the right to become an expandable conceptual space, open to broad and sometimes indiscriminate interpretation. Once the left secured a symbolic association with morality and progress, a particular linguistic tendency began to take shape. Values regarded as positive, progress, liberation, reform, were increasingly grouped under the banner of the left. Meanwhile, whatever was seen as backward, oppressive, or reactionary was placed under the right. Within this framework, the right ceased to function as a coherent body of thought with its own internal logic. Instead, it became a kind of conceptual holding area, a space that absorbed negative associations. One might even describe it as a dumping ground, a category into which elements inconvenient to a left-wing narrative could be deposited. This is not merely a misunderstanding. It reflects a structural pattern in the way political language operates. When a policy produces favorable outcomes, it is often interpreted as a triumph of equality or reform, and therefore attributed to the left's intellectual heritage. But when a movement produces disastrous consequences, it may be reclassified, labeled as right-wing or even far-right, thereby severing its connection to earlier theoretical roots. In this process, the criteria of classification are not stable. They shift according to evaluative need. Through such adjustments, a theory can avoid bearing the full weight of its failures, while negative cases are transferred under a different label. One of the most representative examples is fascism. If we examine its intellectual origins, early fascism had notable intersections with socialist movements. It emphasized mass mobilization, anti-capitalist rhetoric, and a form of collective national will, themes that overlapped, at least in part, with strands of socialist thought. However, after the Second World War, and in light of military defeat and moral catastrophe, fascism was comprehensively condemned. In the post-war narrative, it became firmly categorized as right-wing, even far-right. This classification was shaped less by a detached theoretical analysis and more by the outcome of historical conflict and moral judgment. If one looks strictly at economic control and collective mobilization, the placement is not entirely straightforward. Yet in post-war discourse, the position became fixed. In other words, what determined its location on the spectrum was not purely its structural position within political theory, but its status as a defeated and morally discredited force. The defeated side was moralized as evil, and then placed within the conceptual space of the right. In doing so, the left was able to preserve an image of relative purity. Over time, the right accumulated an expanding list of associations: nationalism, authoritarianism, extremism, even when these currents do not necessarily share a coherent philosophical foundation. Different historical fears and conflicts were gradually poured into the same container, making its contents increasingly heterogeneous. As this semantic pattern repeats, the right ceases to be a symmetrical counterpart to the left. Instead, it becomes an ever-expanding repository of negative cases. Historical episodes, theoretical experiments, or policy failures that sit uncomfortably with a left-wing narrative can be repackaged as right-wing problems. In this way, genuine theoretical reflection is replaced by relabeling. Intellectual responsibility is displaced rather than examined. Over the long term, this practice blurs the contours of intellectual history and weakens the precision of public debate. Political language becomes less analytic and more emotional, less conceptual and more symbolic. And this, at its core, is what it means to say that the right has become the left's dumping ground. If we ask why this semantic structure has been able to endure for so long, we must also consider the position of political science as a discipline. Political science has traditionally been regarded as the core field for studying state power, institutions, and public decision-making. In theory, it occupies an elevated position. Yet, in terms of analytic tools, it has long faced sustained competition from economics. Many political phenomena can be explained using the language of economics: rational choice, cost-benefit analysis, incentive structures. But the reverse is less straightforward. Political science often struggles to explain, using its own conceptual framework, the technical details and efficiency mechanisms of economic systems. common intuition suggests that politics stands above economics, because power appears superior to markets. However, at the level of theory and methodology, economics, with its formal models and testable hypotheses, has gained considerable academic authority. When political science finds itself borrowing the language of economics in order to appear rigorous, questions of disciplinary status and methodological confidence inevitably arise. This subtle competition creates pressure, and under such pressure, scholars may be drawn towards theoretical positions that emphasize the autonomy and moral significance of politics itself. Within this context, socialism becomes an attractive option. It offers moral elevation and an expansive vision of institutional design. It emphasizes collective decision-making, public allocation, and political intervention, bringing politics firmly back to center stage. By contrast, theories that prioritize market mechanisms and spontaneous order distribute decision-making power across individuals and price systems. The visible role of politics is comparatively reduced. When a discipline feels its position challenged, it is perhaps unsurprising that it gravitates towards ideas that expand its own sphere of relevance. This tendency need not arise from bad faith. It may simply reflect an instinct of self-preservation. Yet the consequences can subtly shape conceptual usage. Consider the difference between speaking on behalf of something and belonging to it. In principle, when someone speaks on behalf of an idea, a value, or a social group, they are merely offering an argument or an advocacy. But in a politicized environment shaped by identity, representation is often conflated with membership. To represent becomes to belong. If someone speaks in defense of equality, it may simply be defending a principle, yet they may be interpreted as inherently belonging to a particular ideological camp, as though their entire identity is defined by that value. Similarly, a person may speak on behalf of disabled people, advocating for rights and access. That does not mean they themselves are disabled. Yet, in a label-driven discourse, the two can be casually equated. When representation is reinterpreted belonging, political discussion shifts away from argument and institutional design, and towards identity and categorization. Positions cease to be debatable viewpoints. They become markers of who one is presumed to be. The shift quietly reinforces the legitimacy of certain ideological frameworks, while deepening suspicion towards others. Disagreement is no longer framed as a comparison of theoretical coherence or policy outcomes. Instead, it becomes a question of whether one belongs to the right value system or group. As politics becomes increasingly moralized and identity-driven, its capacity to function as a neutral analytic discipline weakens. And perhaps this, unintended yet consequential, is what we might call the original sin of political scholars. If we attempt to identify a more stable dividing line amid the many shifting and overlapping definitions of left and right, the key may not lie in the abstract contrast between equality and liberty. Instead, it may lie in attitudes towards competition. The deeper and more fundamental difference between the modern left and the right concerns whether competition is acknowledged and incorporated as a core institutional mechanism. Those who introduce competition and accept its functions of selection and elimination tend to align more closely with what we call the right. Those who seek to exclude competition, preferring centralized decision-making over dispersed comparison, tend to align more closely with the left. This distinction becomes particularly visible when dealing with things considered undesirable. If one argues that an authority should directly prohibit something, in order to safeguard certain values from challenge, that is a decompetitive approach. It assumes that the correct answer can be determined in advance and implemented from above. By contrast, if different options are allowed to compete within an institutional framework, with outcomes determined through comparison, choice, and consequence, then competition functions as a filtering mechanism. The former trusts prior certainty. The latter trusts process. The same contrast appears in discussions of equality. If one seeks to eliminate outcome differences by removing competitive mechanisms altogether, competition is treated as the source of inequality. But if one instead focuses on establishing fair rules, ensuring that individuals enter competition under equal conditions, while accepting variation in results, then competition is treated as necessary. Both positions may speak of equality, but one aims at reducing differences in outcomes, the other at fairness in opportunity and procedure. At the level of political labeling, something revealing occurs. Any position that stands in competition with established left-wing proposals is often categorized as right-wing. This very act of classification reflects an attitude towards competition. If alternative political visions are treated as threats that must be excluded, politics becomes an absolutized value system. If, however, competing political philosophies are recognized as legitimate participants within the same institutional arena, politics becomes an ongoing process of comparison and revision. Even debates about so-called political correctness illustrate this boundary. If a particular political viewpoint is treated as beyond question, enforced through norms, social pressure, or reputational sanction, this reflects a decompetitive and absolutist conception of politics. To reject such absolutization, and to insist that different viewpoints must be allowed to debate and compete in public space, is to affirm the necessity of competition. In this sense, the true divide between left and right may not lie in historical labels or rhetorical slogans. It lies in whether competition is regarded as a principle to be institutionalized or a danger to be suppressed. When competition is viewed as inherently harmful and therefore excluded, politics tends towards centralization and certainty. When competition is treated as indispensable and structured into institutions, politics remains open and corrigible. Perhaps this offers a clearer path for understanding the distinction. In contemporary political debate, what is often called the horseshoe theory is used to suggest that the extreme left and the extreme right eventually resemble one another. According to the popular version, the political spectrum is not a straight line but a curved shape, like a horseshoe, where the two ends bend towards each other and nearly meet. However, this explanation usually remains at the level of appearance. It observes that extreme movements display similar behaviors, but it does not fully examine the structural reasons behind the similarity. Nor does it explain why this convergence seems to recur across different historical periods. If we interpret the theory through the framework developed earlier, a more coherent explanation emerges. Extremist movements do not converge because the left and right are symmetrical in essence. They converge because they share two structural features: the elimination of competition and the absolutization of politics. And these two features, particularly in their most concentrated form, are closely associated with certain core tendencies within left-wing thought. When politics is understood as the realization of a single, unquestionably correct value, competition becomes an obstacle. Alternative viewpoints are no longer treated as legitimate rivals, but as threats to be neutralized, absorbed, or eliminated. In this sense, the reason the right often appears as the container of extremism is not because it possesses a single unified core. Rather, it is because radical experiments that fail or are morally discredited can be reassigned to that label. In reality, regardless of whether a movement calls itself left or right, if it suppresses competition, silences dissent, and elevates one idea into an unquestionable absolute, it enters the same structural pattern. The names and symbols may differ. The operational logic is strikingly similar. The proximity between extremes is therefore accidental in terms of spectrum placement. It is structural in terms of institutional design. Once politics is stripped of competition, power inevitably concentrates in the hands of a small group of decision-makers. In order to preserve ideological purity, the system must exclude doubt and alternative proposals. A closed loop forms. Under such conditions, movements that began from very different starting points can gradually resemble one another in their mechanisms of control and organizational form. The similarity is not one of shared values. It is one of converging methods. If the horseshoe theory is understood merely as an observation that the extremes behave similarly, it misses the deeper point. The critical issue is that when politics abandons competitive comparison and installs a single value as the ultimate arbiter, it tends toward centralization and suppression. This structure can be wrapped in different banners and rhetorical traditions, yet its mode of operation remains remarkably consistent. From this perspective, the proper interpretation of the horseshoe theory is not that left and right are identical. It is that all extremisms arise from a common tendency, the transformation of politics from a field of competition into a system of doctrine. When the right is constructed as a dumping ground for negative cases, many extremist examples are placed within it. But the mechanisms that generate those extremisms are often closely connected to the deeper logic of decompetition and absolutization. The convergence of extremes is not a historical coincidence. It is the internal consequence of politics without competition. Drawing these threads together, we can now see why the right has become such a powerful straw man in modern discourse. It is not simply the result of policy disagreement. It is the outcome of a long process of conceptual construction and semantic maneuvering. When political categories are shaped by historical victory and moral judgment, rather than by institutional principles and competitive mechanisms, labels begin to replace arguments. Instead of asking whether a proposal works, whether it is coherent, whether it produces better outcomes, we ask which side it belongs to. Classification overtakes analysis. In such an environment, the right becomes less a defined body of ideas and more a symbolic container, ready to absorb whatever must be rejected in order to preserve a particular narrative. If we are serious about rebuilding meaningful public discussion, the solution may not lie in redrawing the left-right boundary yet again. It may lie in restoring space for competition and comparison. Politics functions best when ideas are allowed to confront one another within shared institutions, when no single value is treated as beyond question, and when disagreement is not automatically moralized into hostility. To reintroduce competition is not to embrace conflict for its own sake. It is to accept that political judgment emerges through process, testing, and revision. Only when politics returns to being contestable and corrigible, rather than absolute and doctrinal, can public debate regain clarity. And perhaps in doing so, we may finally move beyond straw men and to substance. That's all for this video. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, and comment. Every like, subscribe, and comment are a contribution to solving those difficult questions. I look forward to your joining our discussion and making a contribution to solving the difficult questions. Once again, thank you for your watching. Goodbye!